Good evening. Good evening. I am Brent Reedy, the Andrew W. Mellon Director of the Research Libraries here at the New York Public Library. Thank you so much for joining us, whether you are in our sold-out crowd or watching us online. We are so excited to be joined by an old friend tonight, a special lecture from none other than Stephen Kotkin. Stephen is a senior fellow at Stanford's Hoover Institute. He's director of the Hoover History Lab, but many of you might know him from the days before he fled to the West Coast and left us a few years ago, emeritus professor of history and international affairs at Princeton University. It goes without saying he's a brilliant writer, a brilliant historian, and his knowledge and insight into the history and future of geopolitics and authoritarian regimes has given him permanent job security in this day and age. Sadly, it's permanent job security. He's the author of many books, including his magisterial multi-volume biography of Joseph Stalin. You can get a copy out front if you had a chance on the way in. The first volume of which he, in fact, worked on here at the library as a Coleman Fellow, one of the first Coleman Fellows in the first, I think, 5 years of the fellowship program. He is now working on the final volume, Stalin, Totalitarian Superpower, 1941 to 1990s. Stephen is here tonight to mark an incredible occasion, a very important anniversary. We are celebrating the 125th birthday of our Slavic and East European collections. Those materials extend from the early 14th century illuminated manuscripts to books published this year. We're still collecting. They cover languages from Slavic and East European languages to Hebrew to Yiddish to the multitude of languages that once fell under the banner of the Soviet Union. A fun fact, the very first day this building was opened, May 24th, 1911, one of the first books that was requested by a Russian was a book by the Russian writer Nikolai Grat entitled, and I will not attempt the Russian because I don't have the language facility that our other speakers tonight have, but it was a study of Nietzsche and Tolstoy. So we are going to hear from Stephen in a bit, but first we are going to hear a bit from our curator of Slavic and East European Studies, Bogdan Horbal, about this incredible collection, its history, and then Stephen will follow after him. At the end of our time tonight, there will be time for some questions. You should have been handed a little note card on the way in. Please think of questions throughout the night, and we will come around during the lecture and collect those. If you are watching online, you can just put your question into the chat, and we will dutifully write them out and take them up to our speaker as well. In addition, and I'm sorry for those watching online, this isn't for you, but I hope that you saw we have an incredible collection of prints on display right in front as you walked in. Many thanks to Rebecca Shantier, who led the display tonight. They will remain on display after the program. So if you didn't have a chance on the way in, please take a look at just the tip of the iceberg of our incredible collections this evening. Live from NYPL is made possible through the continuing generosity of Celeste Bartos, Manaz Isbahani Bartos, and Adam Bartos. And it would not be possible without all of you. Thank you for your support, and please join me in welcoming Bogdan Horbal.
Good evening, and thank you for coming. Vartan Gregorian does not need an introduction. An Armenian-American academic, educator, and historian who led the library out of the financial crisis of the 70s. However, his first encounter with the library took place years earlier. He described it as follows. The first time I set foot in the New York Public Library was in 1956. I walked along Fifth Avenue, and then I walked down to the New York Public Library and went in. I just headed toward the familiar sign, the Slavonic Division. I walked in, and nobody asked me for an ID. So I thought I had entered there illegally. Quietly and quickly, I left, hoping nobody would catch me. I never knew that the library was free, that it was the people's palace, that you had the right to just go in. Some Slavic and East European materials held at the New York Public Library trace their origins to the two of NYPL's predecessors. As you may know, the Astor and Lenox libraries were merged to become the NYPL in 1895. The funds for this were provided by the Tilden Trust. The Astor Library initiated the process of collecting works in either Latin or West European languages devoted to or printed in Slavic and East European countries, a process that continues to this day. The Lenox Library contributed several Slavic and Baltic vernacular Bibles and liturgical texts. In 1897, the NYPL's first director, John Shaw Billings, suggested collecting Russian language materials. At the same time, a group of Russian New Yorkers sent a request to have Russian materials collecting along with a card catalog of titles that should be acquired. God bless these Russians. In February of 1899, the trustees of the New York Public Library put aside $1,000 to create what was originally described as the section of Russian literature. Housed in the old Astor Library building, it was an instant hit. In 1900, more than 1,000 readers came, and they consulted over 5,000 items out of a total of only 2,298 items. These are astonishing statistics. While the largest part of the library's Slavic collections to this day is Russian, during the early years, a commitment was made to create a broad Slavic and East European collection. Thus, the name of the unit was changed to Slavonic Department during its inaugural year. Throughout the subsequent decades and up to the present, the library has been systematically building collections in many vernacular languages, creating holdings that rank high when compared to those of Ivy League university libraries. Hermann Rosenthal, the founding chief of the Slavonic Department, laid a solid ground for this success. He hired vendors and set up book exchanges with various scholarly institutions across Eastern Europe, some of which continued to be in force for decades to come. In 1924, more than 41,000 readers came to utilize the collections of the Slavonic Division, another astonishing statistic. This took place during the early years of Abraham Yarmolinsky, the profoundly successful chief of the Slavonic Division. Yarmolinsky and Harry Miller-Leidenberg, the chief of Reference Division, undertook a daring book-buying trip to Soviet Russia in 1923, 10 years before Soviet Union was officially recognized by the United States. They purchased or received as gifts some 9,000 books. It is partially thanks to the contacts Yarmolinsky made in Soviet Russia that the library has a remarkable collection of Soviet materials, including publications in various minority languages of the Soviet Union. The main vendor for Soviet materials was Международная книга, a Soviet agency for book export. As shown on this summary of charges, it gave prices in gold rubles. That is in the form of Chervonets coins that were mainly used by the Soviet government for foreign trade operations. When the Soviet Union offered thousands of volumes collected through mass confiscations of private libraries for sale, New York Public Library was among the buyers. In 1931 alone, the library purchased some 2,200 volumes from private library of Grand Duke Vladimir Alexandrovich. The results of work by Rosenthal, Yarmolinsky, and their staff were significant. In 1960, it was concluded that the Library of Congress, Columbia and Harvard universities, and the New York Public Library must be considered equal in value to scholars working in the field of Slavic and East European studies. This early success and collection building became even more significant when the international situation deteriorated. The Soviets halted the sale of materials from confiscated private libraries in the mid-1930s. World War II and made the acquisition of materials practically impossible. And then came the Sovietization of Eastern Europe and Cold War export restrictions, which were devastating to acquisitions. These difficulties coincided with a rise in interest in the peoples of Eastern Europe, prompting the new chief of the Slavonic division, John Misch, a Polish-born linguist, to undertake a trip to Soviet Union, Poland, and Czechoslovakia, during which he established or re-established many contacts. During the post-World War II era, some antiquarian purchases, including magnificent illuminated manuscripts for Spencer collection, were made, but Misch was primarily focused on expanding our collections with contemporary publications. This occurred at the time when the division's readership started to grow beyond the predominantly émigré audiences of the previous decades. College-level students and faculty members, notably from Columbia University, as well as journalists and other enthusiasts of Slavic and East European cultures, began to dominate as readers and engage in more in-depth research. In 1951, almost 87,000 items were served in the Slavonic division. The US economic stagnation in the 1970s hit New York City particularly hard, and the city entered the period of crisis. Limited funds and job freezes made the development of diverse collections extremely challenging during the last years of John Misch, and later under the leadership of Viktor Koresar, an Estonian-born scholar. In 1984, Edward Kasenek became the sixth chief of the Slavonic division. The division was in need of revival. He expanded the staff and took on major tasks. One of the achievements was the improvement in the methods by which the division acquired new materials. The staff of the division and numerous skilled volunteers contributed to the description of various parts of the collections. Some of these descriptions and other papers were presented in international conferences and published. The preservation and restoration of legacy materials was achieved with the help of funds secured from grants, including those from the National Endowment for the Humanities. More than 24,000 images from the division's holdings were digitized and included in the NYPL's digital collections. Many books and serials went to Google to be scanned and placed in HathiTrust. Kasenek and his staff reached out to local and international communities of scholars, émigré communities, and enthusiasts of Slavic topics. These efforts resulted in broader access to the collection by scholars, along with the donations of important private collections and the creation of several endowments. In 1989, the division was renamed the Slavic and Baltic Division to better reflect its holdings. However, 2 decades later, as a part of a broader reorganization, the division was dissolved and its collections were incorporated into General Research Division and such specialized divisions as manuscripts and rare books. Meanwhile, the library has continued to build its Slavic and East European collections. The new phase of collecting in this field coincides with the library's involvement in the creation of the Research Collections and Preservation Consortium, commonly referred to as RECAP. Originally created as a shared physical repository, it has evolved into a shared collection of the New York Public Library as well as Columbia, Harvard, and Princeton universities. Slavic and East European collections were the first to be covered by a collaborative collection development agreement that reduced duplication and has created a much larger collection of unique items. I also want to say that the Slavic and East European items have been regularly included in exhibitions held by the New York Public Library. The most spectacular of them was Russia Engages the World, visited by 100,000 people. In 2007, Graphic Modernism from the Baltic to the Balkans exhibition highlighted the library's sizable collection of avant-garde works on paper. In recent years, the Polanski exhibition of the New York Public Library's treasures showcased several Slavic and East European items, including a Russian translation of Alice in Wonderland by Vladimir Nabokov. You may know that when we do things here, we go big. I mean, really big. Let me conclude this brief presentation with a quote from this timeless classic. Alice asked the cat, "Would you tell me, please, which way I ought to go from here?" The cat answered, "That depends a good deal on where you want to get to." Now I let our keynote speaker, Professor Stephen Kotkin, deal with the fascinating topic of what the future might hold. Thank you.
I wouldn't have minded hearing the rest of that. I was thrilling. It's great to be here. This is one of my favorite places in the world. Just testing you. You think I'm first time on the stage? My wife, I don't see her. She's late. Her plane is late. There was an earlier plane, but she took the later one. And today, again, she was yelling at the screen. She's yelling, "Don't go in there. Don't go in there." It was the video of our wedding. Yeah, I think she's got early Alzheimer's. Every day she tells me that she has no idea what she first saw in me. Do we have time for questions? I'll get there. I got to ease into it a little bit. So much royalty here, so many old friends, such a place that is a miracle. Imagine you have to leave your country. Either you're forced out or you flee before you're forced out. You end up in Harbin or Kobe or Istanbul or Paris or New York. And you may not know anybody there, and you may not speak those languages, and you miss your homeland. And in the case of New York, there's a room. There's a space. And you can walk into the space just like Vartan Gregorian walked in there, and just like I would walk in there. And you could see people also who have the same fate as you. They're literate. They read. They read in languages, however, that are not necessarily the native language in the country they're now in. They're happy to have found a reception, to have been granted access to a new country, but they dream in many cases of the homeland and of returning. And they read, they catch up on the newspapers from home. There's no internet. So they have to come into the room and read them. And then they meet other people reading the same newspapers. And maybe they discover where their kids could go to school, or they discover places where they could get food more cheaply. And they begin to build community out of a room in a library. Connect back to the lives that they were forced out, and connect to the new lives that they have. It's just a remarkable story. Unfortunately, they don't go back. They died of old age here. Some giving up the dream of going back, and some retaining it. And now, here we are again. Here we are again. And again, it's in the millions. And who would have thunk it? It's different now. Newspapers are online. Television is online. You don't need a room. You have a Facebook page now. You can find anybody and everybody that might be interested in what you're interested in. So it's not the same. And yet, the preservation of the culture, the preservation of the values, the preservation of the dreams, the preservation of what you think you're forced to give up and lost and want to get back. That's in the library. Because all of those people that Bogdan showed you, they dedicated their lives, and they hired staff who dedicated their lives to collecting that material and preserving it, so that when people like Vartan Gregorian or like myself or many others who are in this audience walked off the street and into the room, it was there for us to use. And it's going to be there 100 years from now, also for those who walk in off the street. I got my first work experience with Ed Kazanets when he was in charge of the Slavic bibliographer at Berkeley. I was a PhD student at Berkeley. And then he came here, as you heard, in 1984 to take over the division here. And when I came, it was amazing. You could talk to somebody, and they would say, oh, you're interested in that? You ordered that book? You called up that book? I know 6 other things that are on related topics, some of which are not in the catalog, and some of which we should have cataloged a long time ago. Let me bring them to you. It wasn't quite the case that they had met Trotsky and Bukharin when they were here in the reading room, but it seemed like that. They looked back then what I look like today. That is to say, well-worn. Very well-worn people. Anyway, it was thrilling. I had an office here for a whole year in the Coleman Center and could go through the collection. And as you heard, a lot of Stalin Volume 1, the materials I read here. So Vladimir Putin is 71 years old. And once you hit 60 in Russia, your life expectancy for a male is 78. His doctors are probably better than your average doctors. And so he could go well beyond 78, but at some point it's going to happen. Maybe he won't have a stroke and fall down into a puddle of his urine, like the guy I write about in 1953. But maybe he will. However he goes, whenever he goes, he's going to go. So what happens? Where could this go? Not just when he's gone, but while he's still alive, maybe even. So this was the question I ruminated over. And you can guess I'm not very good at predicting the future. Otherwise, I would be at that reception in another part of the library, whether it's Goldman Sachs or whoever it is over there paying the bills, holding their reception. I'd be working over there instead of over here if I could predict the future. I'm still working on the past. I'm getting better. So I can't predict the future, but I can talk about the structures and the potential drivers of change, and therefore, what are the possibilities, or the scenarios, as we call them. So I'm going to go through 6 of them. Those of you who are subscribers to Foreign Affairs will know that my essay on this topic came out in this issue, the May-June issue, which went live, I believe, this morning. And my editor, if you want to know why my works are readable, my editor, Justin Vogt, is sitting right here in the audience, and he's my not-so-secret weapon. The guy is phenomenal. Anyway, so the first possibility that I'm going to put in front of you is Russia becomes France. People ask me, could Russia become democratic? Could there be a democratic revolution? Could Russia finally get rule of law? And I say, you mean, can Russia become France? That's what you're asking. And so France had a monarchical tradition. It had a big, gigantic, absolutist state bureaucracy. It then had this crazy revolutionary tradition, which went this way and that way and this way and that way, and if you avoided the blade, you were lucky. And it threatened its neighbors, as you know from Napoleon. But France doesn't threaten its neighbors anymore. And it killed its king. Okay, the king came back, the emperor came back. You know, it's France. But eventually they got a kind of consolidated republic. They're on their 5th right now, thanks to de Gaulle. I hope to live to see more. That would give me some longevity. I might not. But anyway, you get the point. They've, in some ways, overcome and also assimilated their past, that great monarchical tradition, that big bureaucratic tradition, that crazy revolutionary tradition. They now have a rule of law state, an open society, a free and open society, and they don't threaten their neighbors anymore the way they used to. And so that's it. Because Russia, you see, they also have a monarchical tradition. They also have an absolute state. They also have a crazy revolutionary tradition, and it was crazier than the French one by a lot, which is saying quite a bit. I know those kids up there at Columbia are waiting for the Qatari money to start digging the tunnels under the tent encampment. I study revolution. I spent my whole life doing this. So I've seen a lot. I know where it's going. Anyway, so the Russians, they've had this too. And the threatening the neighbor part also. So when you ask, can Russia become democratic? I say to you, can Russia become France? The distance between today's Russia and today's France, that's the answer to your question. That's the distance they have to travel to become a rule of law, a consolidated, stable, sustained rule of law state with institutions that constrain executive authority, a free and open society. And if you think there's some distance between today's Russia and today's France, well, then you think that there might be a difficult path there to get that. Now, of course, Russia and France are not the same country. There are a lot of differences. But of all the countries in the world, France is the one that's closest to Russia. So Russia becomes France. That's my first potential future. My second potential future is Russia stays authoritarian, it stays nationalist, but it doesn't have to threaten its neighbors because that's self-damaging. The cost of that is too high. So in other words, they pull back a little. They retrench. So Russia retrenching would be the second possible future. You wouldn't get the France outcome. You'd still have the authoritarian regime. They would still potentially be very anti-Western. They would still potentially not have the free and open society. They might even be xenophobic in their nationalism. But the key would be they feel that they cannot take on the world, especially the Western alliance, because it's too costly. It hurts Russia. This is not altruism. This is self-interest. Their view is that Russia deserves to be a great power. Russia has always been a great power, but right now we can't afford what we're doing. We can't afford Putin's trajectory. So we just pull back a little bit, keeping a version of the regime that we have. This would be a terrific outcome in some ways for Ukraine. It wouldn't solve your Russia problem, but it could get them to pull back from the war, not because they love Ukraine, not because they love the West, but because they think the war is damaging Russia. Russia's losing a lot of people. Its demographics are terrible. Russia's a technology desert. Russia's private sector, high-tech private sector, is in Tel Aviv and Yerevan and all sorts of other places that are not Russia. And the people in charge They know this. They're well aware. They're no fools. They know the statistics. They can look and see at the trajectory that they're on. When you're a commodity exporting power, like Russia has been since the 18th century, you need technology transfer like oxygen. And if you're cut off from your sources of technology transfer and you become a technology transfer desert, and all your 20 and 30-year-old high-tech next generation, as I said, are living in Tel Aviv or Yerevan or all the other places we could name, you may feel hurt for Russia as a nationalist retrenchment. Okay, number three. Number three is Russia becomes a Chinese vassal. I bet you didn't think you'd live to see that. Russia becomes a Chinese vassal. You can see that Russia and China are becoming closer and closer. You can see also that there's some reluctance in the embrace. Russia doesn't want to be subjugated by China. China doesn't want responsibility for the mess that is Russia. So Russia's not yet a vassal of China. It's on that trajectory, but you don't get to choose to be a vassal of China. China chooses who its vassals are. And if they think you're a basket case, they want to exploit you, but they don't necessarily want to appoint the government, oversee the policies. They don't necessarily want you to be their vassal. Because you're Russia. And Russia doesn't want to be subjugated to China because at one point, Russia was the big brother and China was the little brother dependent on Russia. And so the pride really hurts to see this. You can see it all over the Russian social media space about the humiliation that China makes everything that Russia used to make, that the things that Russia makes are not as good as what China makes. Russia lost its machine tool industry. China makes almost all the machine tools for Russia now. This is astonishing. I got to tell you, Mao, he didn't have a machine tool industry. He didn't have any industry. Yeah. So how'd that happen? Anyway, okay. So the third is that Russia becomes the vassal of China. And as I say, we're moving in that direction, even though each side is a little bit worried about how deep the embrace might be. But if you burn every bridge in the West, and then you blame the West for the arson, China's really your only game in town, and that dependency really increases. And if you're China, burning bridges also with the US and the West, Russia is an important player for you. Plus, let's admit, it's kind of convenient on the largest land border in the world between Russia and China. You don't actually have to put any soldiers there like you used to have. You can put your shoulders kind of facing, I don't know, Taiwan. Because you don't have to guard that border if Russia's in your pocket. If Russia flips, all of a sudden, if you have a pro-American Russia, you got a really big border to defend. And your Taiwan and all your other scenarios go through some big changes. So no matter how bad Russia is, you can't let Russia go down, because if it goes down, it might go to the other side. So, okay, this leads me to scenario number 4. Russia as North Korea. And you're looking at me the way you used to look at me, Rob. When I used to call up those crazy Soviet books, and you said, can't you read anything that's intelligent? I know that look. How could Russia, 142 times the size of North Korea, become North Korea? It's absurd. Well, like everything, all life is absurd. I think those of you who are over 25 years old know that. And certainly the ones that are my age, you know. Okay. What do I mean Russia becomes North Korea? What I mean is cut off from the world, spoliation as far as the eye can see, mischief, dirty tricks. They're going to empty your crypto accounts if they haven't done it already. So watch out, those of you, I can see this audience with the crypto accounts. They're vulnerable. Isolated, incentivized only to spoliation and mischief, completely dependent on China for a lifeline. But, as I said, if North Korea goes down, the US wins the Korean War. It's unified under South Korea, which is a US ally, and MacArthur, he's up at the Yalu River. Yeah, decades and decades after MacArthur got pushed back, MacArthur's descendants get to the Yalu, and the US and South Korea win the Korean War. What do you think that kind of scenario looks like in Beijing? How about if we just lose the Korean War? Wouldn't that be fun? You know, Mao went in there, lost a huge number of soldiers in the 7 figures, and we'll just lose it. I don't think so. You see, so for example, how about if we have our own nuclear program? The Chinese say, no, you can't do that. And they say, oh, really? And we do it. How about if we have ballistic missiles? Oh, no, you can't do that. North Korean ballistic missiles can reach Beijing. Yes, they can, not just Tokyo. And so there you go. They're just doing anything they want. They're dependent on us. We could choke them in a minute. We could cut off their energy supply immediately. And yet, misbehaving. He kills his half-brother, who's under Chinese protection in Southeast Asia. He just murders him. Yeah. And so can you imagine? You're dependent 100% like North Korea, but you get to do a few things like, hey, you poke the Chinese in the eye. The Chinese say Xi Jinping had a phone call with Putin and got him to agree not to use nuclear weapons. And the Chinese run that up the flagpole, bragging about how they're for peace, and their diplomacy is so effective, and their leader stands above all others. And then a few days later, the Russians announced they're putting tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus. Isn't that fun? Isn't that a great Chinese diplomatic achievement? Yeah. Do the Russians do that on purpose? If you've been in the archives, you know that they don't do those kind of things on purpose. They take credit for having done it on purpose after the fact. But you read the original memos, and they were clueless about the possible effects. But it just teaches you that the more Russia becomes dependent on China, the more China is susceptible to Russian misbehavior, getting out of line. You tell that kid not to touch that cookie jar, you know 100%, 1,000% what's going to happen. Bang, right into the cookie jar, and then, of course, it falls off, and there's glass everywhere on the floor. Yep, that's the North Korea scenario. So that's number 4. I'm just going to check time for a second here. Not that bad. So, you know, Biden and Trump are in the barbershop. I don't know who made the appointments at exactly the same time. Their staffs are just not very sharp. And they're in the different chairs. Trump's got his barber, and Biden's got his barber, and they're doing their work. The guys are not talking to each other. It's a little weird for them to be together. And Trump and Biden's barber finish around the same time, and Trump's barber says, how about a little aftershave on that? And Trump says, oh, no. You put aftershave, that cheap-smelling aftershave, and Melania will think I've been in a brothel. So Biden's barber says, President Biden, how about a little bit aftershave? And Biden says, sure. Jill has no idea what a brothel smells like. We got the Rosenthals right here. That Rosenthal, he was the founding director. And here they are sitting here. The great, 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 great relatives of the Rosenthal. I could do more. Can I do more? No, huh? I'm looking at the boss. I can't do more. All right, I did a Trump one. I'll do a Biden one. We're going to be even-handed. So, you know, in the Democratic Party, they have a tradition asking the president about their underwear. It started with Clinton. Remember with Clinton, they said boxers or briefs. Remember what Clinton answered? Boxers. Right, boxers. And so Obama came along and they asked Obama, boxers or briefs? He thought the question was beneath the dignity of the presidency. Remember, he was a law school dean while he was president. It's just that the United States wasn't a law school. Anyway, he refused to answer. And along comes Joe Biden. They asked Joe, boxers or briefs? Joe looks for a second and he says, depends. Even-handed. Each side got one. All right, what was I talking about, Ed? What was this lecture about? All right, you see that? We got a little bit, yeah. Number 5 is chaos, anarchy. Number 5 is even bigger trouble than the first 4. Number 5 is lookout. I'm not predicting, again, anything. I'm not predicting any of these scenarios. I'm not giving odds on them. I'm just laying out what could happen. The chaos and the anarchy one could be fine. They could just collapse, and the nuclear weapons and the scientists could just spread around the world. And ISIS could be at the next non-proliferation discussions. So yeah, it could get really terrible. Does it mean Armageddon if Russia enters a period, descends into anarchy and collapse? The last couple of times it happened, it wasn't that pretty. That was, of course, the pre-nuclear era, right? In the Tsarist case, it was the nuclear era. In the Soviet case, and there was a lot of concern about all of those weapons, the material for the weapons, the scientists, the technicians. There was a lot of concern about many things. And you can imagine chaos descending on Russia. And the Chinese say, oh, you know what? They have these territories that they stole from us. You see, Russia is the only country still in possession of territories taken from China in unequal treaties, what the Chinese call the century of humiliation. And so there's a whole river basin that the Chinese might want back because they controlled it once. And maybe the other side of the river basin looks good too. And then there's some territories the Japanese kind of like. What they call the Northern Territories, what Russia calls the Kurils. And remember, the Japanese were in possession of Sakhalin for a while. And remember, the Japanese were in occupation of the Russian Far East. And geez, I could spin this out. You know, the Finns, there's this big region called Karelia that was once in Finland. And then there's this big isthmus that Stalin took, in addition to Karelia, that's near St. Petersburg. There's just a whole lot of cans of worms or Pandora's boxes or whatever you want to call them. And so, I don't know. Chaos and anarchy. Again, no prediction, but it is the 5th scenario. All right. We're almost done. You know, I'm good on time for once. And as you can see, my wife is not here. Number 6 doesn't appear as number 6 in the Foreign Affairs article that was published today online. I only have 5 there. So you're getting one more for the same price as all those other people got for only 5. How about that for the New York Public Library? I'm getting kickbacks from the tickets that they sold to you. Sorry, this is New York. It's a symbolic kickback only. But still, it's New York, so they get it. All right. The 6th one is the one that Russia believes is its future, which I call the continental cul-de-sac. It's where Russia is the civilization unto itself. It's self-sufficient, and it's a pole in a multipolar world. And it's a pole because it attracts all of these other countries that are attracted to Russia's model of murdering their own people and impoverishing them and circling the drain. And it's such an attractive model that everyone wants to speak Russian, especially if they're in prison and they have to talk to the guards and bum a cigarette. And this is that great continental cul-de-sac. And the Armenians are really enamored of this. Because, as you know, they had a defense treaty with the Russians, and the Russians did nothing. And the Belarusians love this Russian continental cul-de-sac too, because they lost their country to Russia under Lukashenko. And yeah, the Kazakhs, they want a piece of what Ukraine has right now. Russian missiles destroying their infrastructure and killing their civilians. Yeah, the whole region wants this. In fact, all of global humanity want this because Russia is such an attractive, it's got so much soft power. Yes, this is their vision of the future. Russia as a self-contained, glorious civilization that doesn't need the rest of the world. Forget about the technology transfer, that's just going to magically happen. Forget about the dynamic economy, that's going to appear out of nowhere, anywhere. Forget about the dependency on China, that's going to vanish somehow. I don't know where the Chinese are going to go. And forget about the West and the United States being powerful. That's all going down. That's all decadent. They're all crazy with the values taking over universities and threatening civilization, which is represented by Russia. This continental cul-de-sac is the main vision of Russia that you get from the apologists, the propagandists, but you also get it from a lot of the people that you talk to on the street. Provincials, urbanites, and of course, members of the regime at all levels. I didn't call it a future for Russia because it's failed. It's already failed. It failed as Imperial Russia, which collapsed. It failed as the Soviet Union, which not only collapsed, but lost the territory that Imperial Russia had. And in fact, the soldiers who took an oath to the Soviet Union and then became the soldiers of Russia, they had to retreat out of Eastern Europe and the Baltic states along the same roads as Napoleon had retreated, but now only in the opposite direction. So this Russia continental civilization unto itself has failed. Slavophilism, just about every Slavic people is dying, in the case of Ukraine literally, to get into the EU and NATO. And so the continental cul-de-sac, the future that the Putin regime and the spokespeople of the Putin regime strikes me as not a valid future. I could be wrong about all of these things. But that's why you only have 5 in the Foreign Affairs article, but you got the 6th one tonight. I presented it, let's say, somewhat negatively. I didn't really give it the same love and care that the Russians themselves give it on Telegram and especially on TV channels, Russian TV channels. All right, let me conclude, and then we'll have a question or two. I see we're right on time. So Russia is non-Western. It's European culturally. There's no question that Russia's culturally European. You can't imagine European culture without Russia. That's what the collections here show. The art, the music, the literature, the architecture, the dance, and one could go on. It's astonishing. And it's part of Europe culturally. But institutionally, it's not part of Europe. It's not Western institutionally. Because Western is not a geographical term. It's an institutional matrix. It is limits on executive power. It is the rule of law, an impartial professional judiciary, an impartial professional civil service, a free and open society, free and open media. That's what the West is. Japan is not culturally European at all, but they are thoroughly Western in institutions. They have the institutions in Japan that you would recognize, yes, from France. Yes. And so this is your challenge. How do you get Russia to still be Russia, but acquire those institutions that make it Western? And Russia's identity is wrapped up in being non-Western. The Byzantium version of Christianity versus the Western or Roman version of Christianity. And I could go on. It's not the only piece, but it's a big piece. Non-Western doesn't mean anti-Western. And the anti-Western doesn't mean extreme anti-Western. There are amplitudes of anti-Westernism. You can be a little bit anti-Western. You can be crazy anti-Western. And we're now on the far end of that extreme. And so figuring out how to retain your identity as a non-Western in its own mind, culture, civilization, series of values, series of institutions, and yet get a stable order that delivers peace and prosperity. That's been the challenge of Russian power, and they have decided instead every single time to not follow through on that challenge, but instead to overinvest in their military, to overinvest in their secret police, to underinvest in everything else, and to challenge the West and buttress an autocratic regime at home with enemies at home and enemies abroad. And this has been their strategy. And the strategy is great, except if the West is strong. Because if the West is a mess, Russia's fine. All power is relative. And your strength is only in comparison to somebody else's strength. When my daughter was 5 and we played soccer, I could take the ball off of her. When she was 14, I couldn't touch the ball. She would just go around me and had all these techniques and made me look like the fool I was on the soccer pitch. And so it's all relative. If the West is some 5-year-old playing soccer or the West is some 14-year-old playing soccer, it's a different game. And so if the West is strong, as we discovered in the response to the Ukraine war, Russia's in trouble. And if the West is self-defeating and weak and in decline, and Russia's helping that decline, then Russia can muddle through. The challenge now, however, is not just that the West power balance with Russia is something they got to watch. Now it's the East, too. And so we'll conclude on this. Alexander Nevsky, yes, Alexander Nevsky, who was the Prince of Novgorod, he had a choice. He was attacked by the Teutons, what we would call the Germans, the Western Crusaders bringing Western Christianity from one side, and he was attacked by the Tatar Mongols from the other side. And he decided, Nevsky, to accommodate the Tatar Mongols and to go to their capital and request their permission to be ruler kind of like Beijing, and to fight the German Teutons, because that was Western Christianity that would transform Russia's identity. So paying tribute to the Tatar Mongols is not as bad as allowing the West to conquer you and change your identity, your values, your DNA. And the problem with that analysis is it took Russia centuries to throw the Mongol Tatar horde out. And Russia's interaction with the West was mutually prosperous. And it stayed Russia the whole time. And it didn't lose its identity. And so it's a myth that Russia has to fight the West and accommodate the East. But it is the core myth in some ways of the trajectory that they think they're on now. Anyway, thank you for your attention. These for me? The staff wrote these so I wouldn't be embarrassed. You know how it is. Okay. To what extent does Vladimir Putin have followers who will continue his legacy after his passing? Do you have a plan to accelerate that process so that we can test it? Yeah. These regimes, when they break up, they're rebuilt with the shards of the old pieces. You get the shards. And so you think when you create a revolution that you're starting from year zero, that you're going to overthrow everything and destroy all the old institutions. And in fact, you're going to pull the chain. Actually, we don't have chain. When I was growing up, we pulled the chain, and it went flush down the toilet. Now, I don't know what you do. I know. So you rebuild with the shards. And so you discover, like Tocqueville, Alexis de Tocqueville wrote about the old regime in the French Revolution, that you recreate the things that you're trying to destroy. That you end up rebuilding, and even worse, a stronger absolutist state under the revolution, which you thought you were against. So it's not easy to import institutions from abroad and have them stick. It's not easy to reform institutions when you're using the shards of the old regime. Again, the case is Japan, the Meiji Restoration. They sent out a mission around the world to study everybody's institutions to see what was adaptable to in the Japanese context in the 1870s. Look over the French banking system. Look over the German general staff. Look over the German Constitution. Look over the American banking system and education system. Like a Walmart. Go around and pick off the shelf what institutions you like. And it's a miracle because they stick in the Japanese context. They're able to import institutions, transform the country in Western fashion. It doesn't happen immediately. There's an episode in there where things didn't go well. We're skipping that. In the fullness of time, however. So Putin has plenty of people who would be happy to succeed him from inside his regime. Not the tax collector who's the prime minister. He's just a tax collector. But there are many others that I could go into. And some of them would be less anti-Western. Some of them would be less pro-Chinese. Some of them would be less effective. Some of them would be more effective. All right, let's see what else we got. What does a Trump presidency portend for Russia's alliances with the U.S. and the West? Yeah, what does a Trump presidency portend? Yeah. I mean, really? I have no idea. Even haven't seen it once for 4 years. I still don't know. I'm two doors down from General H.R. McMaster, who was the national security advisor in the Trump regime. I asked him the same question. He looks at me and he says, "Don't get me started." Although his book will be out soon. It's a great book. Yes, I got no idea with Trump. The thing about Trump is he's contrarian. You walk in the office and you tell Trump, he says, "You know, this is what I think you should do." I think you should do an alliance with Putin. And Trump says, get out of here. I'm never doing that. I'm Trump. You don't tell me what to do. And then he could go and do the opposite. Or he could forget he had the conversation with you. What do you think a breakup of the Russian Federation? Do you think a breakup of the Russian Federation is possible or likely? So the Soviet Union was a chocolate bar. You know the chocolate bar? They got these creases. And so the pieces are pre-broken, as it were. You can break them off at the creases. Soviet Ukraine, Soviet Belarus, Soviet Kazakhstan. They have these trash-canistans. The Union of Soviet Socialist Trash-Canistans. And they're ready to be broken. They're already organized. They have state borders. They have constitutions. They got the whole shebang. Russia's not like that. So some version of a Russian dissolution wouldn't look like the Soviet one, which was neat and clean. It broke off like those pieces from a chocolate bar. Except in the Caucasus, the North Caucasus, you could maybe get something of a clean break, which would mean only, what, 1 million deaths. But in the rest of the country, the ethnic minorities are not a majority in their republics, as they're called, and they're all in the interior of Russia with nowhere to go. So it's possible, but it wouldn't be what we would think it would look like. The possible scenario is the one where your neighbors come in and reclaim the furniture that they think is theirs. What is the importance of Russian oil and gas industry in their future? Well, it's pretty important in their present. That's how they're buying everything. So you think about this. How do they fight this war? We didn't talk about the war. The war is too big a subject to squeeze in here. But this is a piece I got to tell you about. There's a gigantic group of elites who have made a fortune on this war. Because one day it was a Starbucks, and now it's a Russia Bucks. They just changed the nameplate and they gave it to a friend. And that friend now has a massive revenue stream. And that went on across the economy. And all of these people got valuable properties, valuable businesses for nothing. Are they pro-war? They couldn't be more pro-war. Because they want even more properties. They want even more self-enrichment. And then you got the guys in the provinces who have no prospects because there's no employment there. But hey, I'll pay you 9 times the average monthly wage for you to sign up to fight against the Ukrainians. And so you have a huge population underclass that is now making much higher than middle-class salaries as soldiers. And you are recruiting 30,000 soldiers a month without announcing a mobilization. That's 350,000 soldiers a year. And if they get killed on the battlefield, their family gets $90,000 one-time payment, which I got to tell you goes a really long way in the Russian provinces. You can buy half the province with the 90K. And so when Gertz Ali wrote this book about the Nazis, and he talked about how a lot of Nazism was driven by the confiscation of Jewish property, the confiscation of everyone's property that they could get their hands on it, the subhumans and everybody else. And Goering was wearing a ring on each finger, and they all had the gold. And he was denounced because he made Nazism look like cynicism and just self-enrichment when it was really an ideology. And the answer is, it was an ideology. They were Nazis. But the self-enrichment was not a small factor. Self-interest and conviction is power. And so with the Russian case, we don't know how much they believe in this war. It may only be a self-enrichment. but it's an incredible self-enrichment. And when they import that stuff from China, 90% of their semiconductors, for example, now come from China, as well as the machine tools. They pay for it with the oil and gas, as far as the eye can see. Nobody in this room will live to see the end of natural gas, and neither will your children. All right, we're running out of time here. We're now in what's called injury time. It's 6 minutes over. The referee has allowed it to go longer because some of you were injured during the game. And so the refs has added that injury time for your injury. I'll go a tiny bit more, and then we'll release the hostages. I actually think the door's open. What do you think is a wise policy for the United States? What kind of policy should we adopt regardless of the scenarios? Thanks. Let's end on that because that's actually how the peace ends. The foreign affairs, 5 futures of Russia ends. So this is going to be even more banal than everything I've said so far. You triumph in the international system because you're successful. You invest in yourself. You do better things. Other people, other countries see this. They look up to you. They want to be allied with you. They want to be your friends. They want some of your secret sauce. You destroy yourselves. You look like a mess. You have politics that are paralyzed or ineffective. You fail to invest in your people properly. You have rent-seeking and theft and all sorts of things, monopolies. And the rest of the world doesn't necessarily think that's a good model for them. It's the same strategy that George Kennan outlined. It's the same strategy that was successful in the Cold War. So yeah, you got to invest in yourself. So let's do tick a couple of those boxes. There are 32, 34 million 18 to 24-year-olds in the United States. 13 million of that 33, 34 million are in higher education. 13 million. Of that 13 million, in the Ivy Plus, the Ivy Leagues, plus University of Chicago, Stanford, Ivy Plus, of the 13 million in higher ed, Ivy Plus, 100,000. 100,000 out of 13 million. 150% of the conversation on higher ed is about those 100,000, not about the 13 million. And you see, they go to state colleges, they go to community colleges, two-year colleges. Maybe some of you went there. And they can't get into the nursing class because it's full. And they can't get into the coding class because it's full. So let's talk about 200 kids play acting revolution on a campus where the 100,000 people are. Or let's invest like crazy in community colleges and incentivize them to perform better and double down on the ones that perform better. How about you need people who can make things and do things? How about if we resurrect vocational training? How about if we resurrect vocational training with AI, AI-inflected vocational training? Being at Stanford, I follow the AI stuff really closely, and most of the recent research is all about how lower-skilled workers have a higher increase in productivity from the application of AI to industrial processes. Yeah. AI is not about riffing. It's not about BSing. We are good at that already. AI is about transforming industrial processes. And that's where AI-inflected vocational training needed like oxygen. I could go on. Remember when the Astors and the Carnegies built libraries? Yeah, you remember because we're standing in it. We're no longer in the reservoir. We're in the New York Public Library. Let's build maker facilities for biotech so that all the kids who used to go to the library to read and find out things about the world and learn who they wanted to be, they can now make things. And we can have the next Carnegie or the next Astor build maker labs across the country like libraries. And I could go on. How about math? We have 1.5 million math teachers in the United States. 1.5 million. And so the #1 national security import of the United States is what? It's math. We import math from East Asia. We import math from South Asia. We import math from West Africa. The kids coming here, they know math. And our kids don't know math. That's why they major in themselves and their grievances. Yes, they do. So we need 1 million math teachers. We got 1.5 million. I want another 1 million. And I could go on. That's the answer. Wherever Russia goes, whatever Russia does and doesn't do, we can be ready. This is not rocket science. I told you it was going to be banal. And then all the tweaks of the political system where you incentivize normality and coalition building and compromise rather than incentivizing craziness and performance politics and getting a slot on Red Army Channel or the Putsch Channel or whatever those channels were called, right? Fox News and MSNBC. Yeah, how about tweaking the incentives a little bit? It's been done before. Okay, so I could go on about this, but all of this is possible because we have corrective mechanisms. Authoritarian regimes don't have corrective mechanisms. They get a Putin or a Xi Jinping, and they have them till they die. We get, call them whatever you want, and we have them till they're done, which is usually 4 years, sometimes 8 years. I know it's a long time. Life is short, but it's over. And then we get the next moron.